The rain lashed against the earth with an unrelenting fury, each drop a sharp sting that seeped through Marcus's battered coat. His boots sank into the mud with every step, the forest trail barely discernible in the storm's chaos. Lightning forked above, illuminating gnarled branches that looked like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. He trudged forward, jaw set, refusing to let the storm win. This wasn't the first storm Marcus had weathered. He'd survived worse: gunfire, ambushes, the kind of violence that stripped a man of his soul and left him a hollow shell. But even he had limits, and the biting cold was leaching what little strength he had left. Borrowed time. That's what it felt like. Marcus had lived through enough scrapes with death to know he was on borrowed time, and tonight, the debt might finally come due. Then he saw it, a dark opening in the hillside, half concealed by undergrowth and rain-slicked roots. A cave. Shelter. He pushed through the brambles and ducked inside, his senses immediately sharpening. The space wasn't large, but it was dry. The musty scent of earth filled his lungs as he took a step forward, water dripping from his coat onto the stone floor. He shook off the rain and turned toward the faint glow that caught his eye. A fire, barely more than embers, flickered at the cave's center. Two figures huddled close to it, and Marcus froze. The first figure was unmistakably alien. A woman with skin the color of dusk, a deep, bruised purple that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Her large, black eyes glinted with fear as she pulled the second figure, a child, closer to her. The boy was smaller, his purple skin mottled with lighter patches. His wide eyes locked onto Marcus, filled with a mixture of curiosity and terror. "Stay back," the woman rasped, her voice low and guttural. Marcus raised his hands slowly, palms out. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." The woman didn't relax. Her thin, clawed fingers tightened protectively around the boy, her posture coiled like a spring. Marcus's eyes flicked over them, noting their gaunt frames and hollow cheeks. They were starving, their bodies frail, their movements slow. He let out a slow breath and eased his pack off his shoulders, keeping his movements deliberate. He opened it and pulled out a small packet of dry rations. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the ground between them. "Eat," he said gruffly, stepping back to the cave wall. "You look like you need it more than I do." The woman hesitated, her sharp eyes darting between Marcus and the food. She sniffed the air, a subtle gesture that reminded Marcus of a cornered animal. Finally, she snatched the packet and tore it open with her teeth, handing the first piece to the boy. The child devoured the food, crumbs spilling onto his lap. For a moment, the woman watched him, her expression softening. Then she ate as well, slower, as though every bite was a calculated decision. Marcus slid down the wall, sitting with his back against the cold stone. The fire's weak warmth barely reached him, but it was better than being out in the storm. "You're not afraid of me?" he asked after a long silence. The woman's eyes narrowed. "Should I be?" "Probably," he said, his tone flat. The boy whispered something, his voice high and musical. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but they were filled with a child's innate curiosity. The woman responded in the same language, her voice softer this time. "What did he say?" Marcus asked, surprising even himself with the question. The woman hesitated before answering. "He asked if you're dangerous." Marcus chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Smart kid. Tell him yes." The woman tilted her head, studying him as though trying to solve a puzzle. "Then why did you help us?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He stared at the fire, the embers glowing like dying stars. He thought about the countless faces he'd seen over the years, some pleading for mercy, others twisted in rage or pain. He thought about the lives he'd ended and the ones he'd saved. "Didn't feel right walking away," he said finally. "That's all." The boy had finished eating and was now leaning against the woman, his eyes heavy with sleep. She wrapped an arm around him, her claws tracing gentle patterns on his back. "Valia," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. Marcus frowned. "What? My name?" "It's Valia." He nodded, his face impassive. "Marcus." Valia's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting, the wind howling like a living thing. But inside the cave, the tension began to ease, the fire casting soft shadows on the walls. The boy, Soln, spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Valia smiled faintly and translated. He wants to know if you're staying. Marcus sighed, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Guess I don't have much of a choice, he muttered. Not unless I want to drown out there. Valia gave a small nod, her expression softening. For the first time, she seemed to relax, her shoulders lowering as if some unseen burden had shifted. As the night wore on, the storm raged outside, but the cave grew quieter. Marcus watched the mother and child as they huddled together, their strange, shimmering skin catching the firelight. He didn't know what had driven them here or what they were running from, but for now he wouldn't ask. For the first time in years, Marcus felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't guilt or regret. It was softer, subtler, and far more dangerous. He pushed the thought away, closing his eyes as the rain drummed against the earth. The storm hadn't let up by morning. Rain hammered the earth in a steady rhythm, drumming against the cave's walls and pooling at its entrance. Marcus awoke to the faint sound of quiet conversation. It wasn't in a language he understood, but the tone was soft, intimate, almost melodic. He opened his eyes to see Valia crouched by the dying embers of the fire. Solon sat beside her, his small hands cradling what remained of the rations Marcus had shared. The boy's face lit up as he spoke, gesturing animatedly with his hands. Valia listened intently, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The sight caught Marcus off guard. He'd never associated aliens, any of them, with such tender moments. In his line of work, they were enemies, assets, or obstacles. Never people. You two always as chatty? Marcus's voice cut through the quiet. Valia flinched, her smile vanishing as she turned toward him. Solon froze, clutching the food to his chest like a frightened animal. Marcus sighed and sat up, brushing dirt from his coat. Relax. If I wanted trouble, you wouldn't have woken up to a fire. Valia's shoulders eased slightly, though her wary eyes didn't leave his face. You were awake before us, she said cautiously. Marcus shrugged. Old habits. Light sleeper. He gestured toward Solon. He doesn't seem to be. Valia glanced at the boy, who was now nibbling on the rations with deliberate slowness, as if trying to make them last. He hasn't slept soundly in weeks, she admitted. Because of the storm? Marcus asked. Because we've been running, she replied, her voice heavy with weariness. Marcus leaned back against the cave wall, crossing his arms. Running from what? She hesitated, then shook her head. It's not your concern. Fair enough, Marcus said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. The silence stretched, broken only by the rain and the occasional crackle of the dying fire. Marcus reached for his pack and pulled out his knife, inspecting the blade. You should eat, he said without looking up. We've already taken too much from you, Valia replied. Marcus snorted. It's not charity. Can't stand the sound of people starving. Makes my skin crawl. Valia frowned, her expression skeptical. A strange sentiment for someone like you. Marcus's eyes flicked toward her, sharp and cold. And what's that supposed to mean? She didn't flinch. You carry yourself like a man who's done terrible things. Your eyes, they don't look away from blood. They're used to it. Marcus let the accusation hang in the air. He didn't deny it. You don't know anything about me, he said finally, his voice low. And yet I'm not wrong, Valia countered. Solon looked between them, his wide eyes darting nervously. Marcus sighed, the tension draining from his shoulders. Eat, he said again, tossing another ration packet toward her. I'm not arguing with you on an empty stomach. This time, she didn't refuse. The rain continued unabated for 2 more days. The cave, though dry, grew colder, and the air carried a damp chill that seeped into their bones. Marcus spent most of the time sharpening his knife, his movements deliberate and methodical. Valia tended to Solon, keeping him occupied with stories Marcus couldn't understand. By the 3rd night, a strange rhythm had settled between them. They didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't hostile. Marcus found himself watching Solon more than he cared to admit. The boy had an energy about him, a resilience that reminded Marcus of someone he couldn't quite place. "You're good with him," Marcus said one evening, surprising even himself. Valia glanced up from where she sat, her claws combing through Solon's short, downy hair. "He's my son. It's my duty to protect him." "Not what I meant," Marcus replied. "Most kids would be terrified living like this." "He's not. He hides it well," Valia said softly. She looked at Solon, her expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. He seemed too much for his age. Marcus didn't respond. He understood that kind of pain. Solon, oblivious to their conversation, stood and wandered toward Marcus. He stopped a few feet away, his wide, black eyes fixed on the knife Marcus held. "What's that?" Solon asked, his voice curious but cautious. "A tool," Marcus said simply. "For what?" "Surviving." Solon frowned, tilting his head. "Is it dangerous?" "Yes," Marcus replied. Solon's frown deepened. "Why do you need dangerous things?" Marcus glanced at Valia, who watched them closely. Then he looked back at Solon. "Sometimes the world doesn't give you a choice. You do what you have to stay alive." Solon considered this, his small brow furrowed. "But you're not hurting anyone now." Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the boy's simple logic. "No," he said after a moment. "Not now." Solon's face brightened. "Then maybe you don't need it anymore?" Marcus chuckled, a low, rough sound. "It's not that simple, kid." Valia's voice broke in, gentle but firm. "Come ya, Solon. Let Marcus be." Solon hesitated, then trotted back to her side. Valia pulled him close, her gaze lingering on Marcus. "He sees something in you," she said quietly. Marcus shook his head. "He's a kid. Kids see what they want to see." "Perhaps," Valia said. "Or perhaps he sees what you could be." Marcus didn't reply. He turned his attention back to his knife. But her words stayed with him, unwelcome and unshakable. On the fifth day, the rain finally stopped. Marcus stepped outside, the air sharp and clean in his lungs. The world was quiet, save for the distant drip of water from the trees. Valia joined him, Solon trailing behind. She looked at the horizon, her expression unreadable. "We should go," she said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "We? It's safer in numbers," Valia said, her voice steady but her eyes cautious. "You're strong, capable. If you travel with us, we might survive longer." Marcus smirked. "And what do I get out of it?" "Companionship," Valia said without hesitation. Marcus laughed, the sound bitter. "I've done fine on my own." Valia held his gaze. "Have you?" The question hung between them, like the weight of the storm clouds that had finally cleared. Solon tugged at Marcus's coat, his eyes hopeful. "Please," the boy asked softly. Marcus sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You two better keep up," he muttered. Valia smiled, faint but genuine. "We will." As they set off, the sun broke through the clouds, casting the forest in golden light. For the first time in years, Marcus felt the faintest glimmer of something unfamiliar. Hope. The forest had grown denser with every mile they traveled, the trees towering higher, their canopies interlocking to form a ceiling of green and gold. Shafts of light pierced through gaps in the leaves, dappled patterns dancing across the forest floor as the trio moved in near silence. The stillness felt unnatural, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Marcus led the way, his knife drawn, slicing through the occasional stubborn vine that blocked their path. Valia and Solon followed closely behind. Solon's curiosity had returned with full force, his small hands reaching out to touch moss-covered logs and pluck brightly colored leaves from low-hanging branches. Valia tried to keep him close, her grip on his wrist firm but not harsh. Marcus glanced back occasionally, his expression unreadable. "We need to cover more ground," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "This place might look peaceful, but I don't trust it." Valia adjusted the strap of the makeshift pack she carried, her dark eyes scanning the forest around them. "Do you trust anything?" she asked, her tone light but tinged with genuine curiosity. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he stopped and crouched, inspecting the ground. His fingers brushed over faint impressions in the dirt. Tracks. Human or close enough. His jaw tightened. These tracks are fresh, he muttered, standing and slipping his knife back into its sheath. We're not alone out here. Valia's expression darkened, her body tensing. Are they following us? Hard to say, Marcus replied. But if they are, we'll know soon enough. The discovery of the tracks seemed to put everyone on edge. Solon, sensing the change in the adult's demeanor, grew quieter, staying closer to his mother. They moved more quickly now, Marcus's pace relentless. The forest around them grew thicker, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. Every sound, a snapping twig, a rustling bush, made Valia flinch, her eyes darting toward the source. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, they had reached a small clearing. A ridge of jagged rocks rose to their left, and below it, a narrow stream wound its way through the valley. Marcus stopped, turning to face them. We'll camp here, he said. The rocks give us some cover, and the stream's close enough to refill the canteens. Valia nodded, lowering the pack to the ground. Solon sank to his knees, clearly exhausted, but his eyes lit up when he saw the stream. He scrambled to his feet, looking at his mother with barely contained excitement. Can I go play in the water? He asked. Stay close, Valia warned, her voice firm. Don't wander out of sight. Solon nodded eagerly and ran toward the stream. Marcus watched him go, his gaze sharp. You're too lenient with him, he said to Valia. This isn't the kind of place where you let a kid run wild. He's a child, Valia replied, her tone defensive. He needs moments of joy, even here. Marcus shook his head. Moments like that get people killed, or they keep people alive, Valia countered, meeting his gaze with defiance. He's stronger than you think. He has to be. Marcus didn't argue, but his frown deepened. He turned away, busying himself with starting a fire. Sparks caught the dry tinder, and soon, a small flame danced at the center of the clearing. Valia sat beside Solon at the stream's edge, her hands gently combing through his hair as he splashed his hands in the water. As the fire grew brighter, Marcus found his eyes drawn to them again. Valia's silhouette against the fading light, her purple skin glowing faintly, was oddly serene. For a moment, he allowed himself to wonder what it would be like to feel normal, to sit by the fire, share stories, and laugh without keeping one hand on his knife. You're staring, Valia said, breaking his thoughts. Marcus blinked, startled. Just keeping watch, he replied curtly. Valia smirked, her expression softening. You don't have to lie to me, Marcus. I'm not blind. Marcus grunted, turning his attention back to the fire. You should get some rest. We'll need to move early tomorrow. Valia hesitated, then stood, guiding Solon toward the fire. You need rest too, she said. You can't protect us if you collapse from exhaustion. I've gone longer without sleep, Marcus muttered, but he didn't argue further. He watched as Valia laid a blanket over Solon, the boy curling up against her side, his breathing slowing as he drifted to sleep. The forest grew quieter as the night deepened, the usual hum of insects and distant animal calls fading into an eerie stillness. Marcus sat by the fire, his knife resting on his knee. His senses were sharp, his eyes scanning the dark edges of the clearing. Valia stirred beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't let your guard down, do you? Can't afford to, Marcus replied without looking at her. You've lived like this for a long time, she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus's lips twitched into a faint, humorless smile. Longer than I care to admit. Valia leaned back, her gaze fixed on the stars visible through the gaps in the trees. It must be exhausting. Marcus said nothing. She didn't press him, but the silence between them was heavy with unspoken truths. Then, a sound broke the quiet, a soft rustling in the underbrush. Marcus tensed, his knife already in his hand as he rose to his feet. Valia's hand went to Solon, pulling him closer as her eyes searched the darkness. What is it? She whispered. Marcus didn't answer. He stepped away from the fire, his movements slow and deliberate. The rustling grew louder, closer. His heart pounded, Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. And then it stopped. The clearing fell silent again, the tension almost unbearable. Marcus didn't lower his knife. "Whoever's out there," he said, his voice low and steady, "you've got one chance to show yourself. If you don't, I'll assume you're a threat." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped into the firelight. It was humanoid, but impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its movements fluid and unnatural. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Marcus could feel its gaze, cold and calculating. Valia's breath caught, her grip on Solon tightening. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, as if studying them. It didn't speak, but its presence radiated menace. Marcus shifted his stance, his knife gleaming in the firelight. "Stay behind me," he said to Valia, his voice calm but firm. The figure took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Marcus tightened his grip on the knife, his mind racing. He didn't know who or what he was dealing with, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary encounter, and it was far from over. The figure loomed at the edge of the firelight, its long limbs swaying unnaturally as if it wasn't entirely tethered to the ground. The hood obscured its face, but Marcus could feel its attention fixed squarely on him. The weight of that gaze made his skin crawl. "Identify yourself," Marcus demanded, his voice steady but sharp. His knife gleamed in the flickering firelight, ready to strike. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it cocked its head to the side, a jerky, bird-like motion that set Marcus further on edge. "Marcus," Valia whispered, clutching Solon tightly. Her voice quivered, but her eyes were fierce, darting between him and the intruder. "What is that?" Marcus didn't look back. "Something that shouldn't be here," he said, his tone low. The figure raised a hand, long, skeletal fingers emerging from the dark folds of its robe. For a moment, Marcus thought it would attack, but instead, it reached into the folds of its cloak. "Stop!" Marcus barked, stepping forward with his knife raised. The figure froze, then slowly withdrew a small, glowing device. It resembled a stone, its surface etched with intricate patterns that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The figure held it out as if offering it to Marcus. "What is it doing?" Valia asked, her voice barely audible. "Trying to bait us," Marcus replied through gritted teeth. The figure took another step forward, holding the device higher. Marcus caught a faint hum emanating from it, a sound that seemed to vibrate in his skull. The sensation was strange, not painful, but deeply unsettling. "Stay back," Marcus growled. The figure ignored him, moving closer. Marcus didn't wait. He lunged forward, his knife slicing through the air with precision. The blade should have met resistance, but instead, it passed clean through the figure's arm, as if cutting through smoke. The limb dissipated, the shadowy material swirling before reforming like mist. "What the hell?" Marcus muttered, stumbling back. The figure tilted its head again, almost mockingly, before retreating into the darkness. The glowing device floated where it had stood for a moment before falling to the ground with a soft thud. "Marcus, don't touch it," Valia warned, her voice taut with fear. "I wasn't planning to," Marcus replied, his heart pounding. The forest fell silent again, as though the encounter had sucked all life from it. The flames of the campfire flickered weakly, casting distorted shadows. "What was that thing?" Valia asked, her voice breaking the quiet. "Not human, that's for sure," Marcus said. He crouched by the glowing object, careful not to touch it. "And not friendly." The device hummed softly, its etched patterns shifting like living circuitry. Marcus studied it, his instincts warring with his curiosity. Valia stepped closer, keeping Solon tucked behind her. "It didn't attack. It could have, but it didn't." "That doesn't mean it wasn't dangerous," Marcus said, rising to his feet. "It left this for a reason. Either it's a trap, or it's baiting us into something worse." "We can't leave it here," Valia said firmly. "If it's connected to those who are after us, it might be the only clue we have." Marcus hesitated, his jaw tightening. Every instinct told him to leave the device behind, and keep moving. But Valia's words struck a chord. If this thing was linked to the people hunting her and Soln, knowing more about it could mean the difference between life and death. Fine, Marcus said reluctantly. He grabbed a piece of cloth from his pack and wrapped the device carefully, avoiding direct contact. The next morning, the world seemed unnaturally quiet. The forest, once alive with the chatter of birds and the rustling of small creatures, now felt empty. Even Soln, normally bursting with energy, stayed close to Valia, his usual curiosity dulled by the memory of the shadowy figure. Marcus led the way, his hand never straying far from his knife. The wrapped device hung from his pack, its faint hum audible even through the layers of fabric. As they walked, Valia broke the silence. "Do you think that thing was sent to track us?" "Maybe," Marcus replied, scanning the forest ahead. "Or maybe it wasn't tracking us at all. Maybe it was sent to warn us." Valia frowned. "Warn us? Why would it do that?" Marcus shrugged. "Not everything's black and white. Maybe it's not working for the people chasing you. Maybe it's working against them." Valia fell silent, her brow furrowed in thought. By midday, they reached the edge of the forest. Beyond the trees lay a stretch of rocky plains, the terrain harsh and uninviting. Marcus surveyed the area, his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of movement. "We'll be exposed out there," Valia said, her voice tense. "I know," Marcus replied, "but staying in the forest isn't safe either. If that thing comes back, we won't have the cover of daylight to help us." Reluctantly, Valia nodded. She adjusted her pack and took Solon's hand. They moved quickly across the plains, the sun beating down on them. The ground was uneven, littered with jagged rocks that forced them to watch every step. Solon stumbled once, but Marcus caught him before he fell. "Careful, kid," Marcus said, his tone softer than usual. "Sorry," Solon mumbled, his cheeks flushing. As they pressed on, a low rumble began to build in the distance. Marcus stopped, his body going rigid. "What now?" Valia asked, her voice strained. The rumble grew louder, accompanied by a faint vibration in the ground. Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Something's coming," he said grimly. From the horizon, a group of figures emerged, moving fast. They were humanoid, but their forms were encased in sleek, dark armor that gleamed like obsidian. Their movements were precise, mechanical, and unerringly coordinated. Valia's grip on Solon tightened. "They found us." Marcus drew his knife, his expression hard. "Get behind me," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The armored figures spread out as they approached, forming a line that cut off any chance of escape. One of them stepped forward, its helmet retracting to reveal a pale, angular face. "Valia of Arkan," the figure said, its voice smooth but cold. "You are ordered to surrender the child." Valia's breath hitched. "No!" The figure's eyes flicked to Marcus, its expression unreadable. "And you, this isn't your fight. Walk away, and we'll spare you." Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's not how this works." The figure tilted its head, as if amused. "Then you've chosen death." Marcus stepped forward, his knife gleaming in the sunlight. "You first." The air seemed to freeze as both sides braced for the fight. Marcus tightened his grip, his muscles coiling like a predator about to strike. The armored figures raised their weapons, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Then, all hell broke loose. The first shot cracked the air, a sharp burst of sound that seemed to ripple across the plains. Marcus moved instinctively, yanking Valia and Solon down behind a jagged outcropping. Dust and debris exploded around them as another round struck the ground nearby, sending a tremor through the rocks. "Stay low," Marcus barked, his voice harsh but steady. He peeked over the edge of the stone, assessing their attackers. The armored figures advanced with military precision, their weapons glowing faintly as they prepared to fire again. Valia pressed Solon tightly to her chest, her purple skin shimmering in the harsh sunlight. "We can't outrun them," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We don't need to," Marcus replied, his knife flashing as he drew it. "We just need to make them bleed." Valia's eyes widened. "You can't take them all." "Watch me," Marcus said, his grin sharp and humorless. Before Valia could protest, he was already moving. He darted from cover, his lean frame a blur of motion as he sprinted toward the nearest enemy. The soldier raised its weapon, but Marcus was faster. He slid under the barrel, his knife slicing through the armored joint at the soldier's knee. Sparks erupted as the figure crumpled, its weapon firing wildly into the air. Marcus didn't stop. He grabbed the fallen weapon, rolling to avoid a volley of shots from the others. The rifle hummed in his hands, its alien design unfamiliar but intuitive. He squeezed the trigger, and a streak of blue energy lanced out, striking another soldier in the chest. The impact sent the figure sprawling. "Marcus!" Valia shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. He turned just in time to see a third soldier charging toward her and Soln, a blade extending from its gauntlet. Valia shielded Soln with her body, her eyes blazing with defiance. Marcus didn't think. He fired, the shot tearing through the soldier's helmet. The figure staggered and collapsed, its weapon clattering to the ground. "You okay?" Marcus called, his voice tight. Valia nodded, her face pale but determined. "We're fine. Keep going." Marcus's lips quirked in a faint smirk. Didn't plan on stopping. The battle raged on, each moment stretching into a lifetime. Marcus moved with lethal efficiency, his knife and stolen weapon cutting through the enemy ranks. But the soldiers were relentless, their numbers and coordination forcing him to constantly stay one step ahead. Behind him, Valia fought to keep Soln calm, her hands trembling as she whispered reassurances. "We'll get through this," she murmured, though the fear in her eyes betrayed her words. Soln clung to her, his small frame shaking. "Is Marcus going to die?" "No," Valia said firmly. "He's stronger than they are." Marcus's muscles burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The stolen rifle was nearly depleted, its energy reserves flickering. He ducked behind a boulder, his mind racing. He needed a plan. A sharp cry drew his attention. Valia was struggling with one of the soldiers, her claws raking against its armor as it tried to wrest Soln from her grasp. Marcus surged forward, his body moving before his mind caught up. He collided with the soldier, driving his knife into the vulnerable spot at its neck. The soldier spasmed and fell, but not before landing a solid blow to Marcus's side. Pain flared through him, sharp and unyielding. He staggered, blood soaking the fabric of his shirt. "You're hurt!" Valia exclaimed, her voice thick with panic. "Just a scratch," Marcus lied, gritting his teeth. He handed her the rifle. "Can you use this?" Valia took the weapon hesitantly, her hands shaking. "I'll try." "Point and shoot," Marcus said. "And don't hesitate." The remaining soldiers closed in, their movements relentless. Marcus positioned himself between Valia and Soln and their attackers, his knife steady in his hand despite the pain coursing through his body. "You're outnumbered," one of the soldiers said, its voice distorted by the helmet's modulator. "Surrender, and we might let the child live." Marcus's laugh was low and dangerous. "You think I believe that?" The soldier didn't respond. It raised its weapon, the barrel glowing ominously. Before it could fire, Valia's stolen rifle discharged. The shot struck the soldier square in the chest, sending it sprawling. Marcus glanced back, his expression unreadable. "Nice shot." Valia's hand still trembled, but her grip on the rifle was firm. "Don't expect me to do all the work." Marcus smirked, turning back to the remaining soldiers. "Wouldn't dream of it." The tide began to turn. Valia's unsteady but determined aim gave Marcus the cover he needed to press the attack. Together, they fought with a desperation born of survival, each moment a battle against exhaustion and fear. Finally, the last soldier fell, its body collapsing in a heap of twisted metal and scorched armor. The plains grew eerily silent, the echoes of the fight fading into the distance. Marcus stood in the aftermath, his chest heaving. Blood dripped from his side, staining the ground beneath him. "Marcus," Valia said, rushing to his side. "You're bleeding badly." "I've had worse," Marcus said, though his voice was weak. He sank to one knee, the adrenaline draining from his body. Valia knelt beside him, her hands hovering over his wound. We need to stop the bleeding. I'll be fine, Marcus muttered, though his vision blurred. Valia's jaw tightened. Stop pretending you're invincible. Let me help you. Marcus blinked, surprised by the intensity in her voice. He nodded reluctantly. All right, do what you have to. As Valia tended to his wound, Solon sat close by, his small hand resting on Marcus's. You saved us, Solon said quietly. Marcus looked at the boy, his expression softening. That's what I'm here for. You're a hero, Solon said with childlike certainty. Marcus chuckled weakly. Not quite, kid. Valia glanced at him, her eyes unreadable. Maybe more than you think. Marcus didn't reply. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of the battle finally settle. For now, they were safe, but he knew the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the plains in hues of orange and gold. Smoke from the scorched battlefield still lingered in the air, a reminder of the chaos they had just survived. Marcus sat against a jagged boulder, his face pale and slick with sweat. Valia knelt beside him, her purple hands carefully pressing a cloth against his wound. You're lucky, she said, her tone sharp despite the gentleness of her touch. A few inches deeper, and you wouldn't be sitting here. Marcus smirked weakly. Guess I have a knack for dodging the worst of it. Valia didn't smile. Her dark eyes remained fixed on his side, where blood seeped through the makeshift bandage. Knack or not, you can't keep this up. You're not invincible, Marcus. Never said I was, he muttered. Solon hovered nearby, his small frame taut with worry. He held the glowing device they had taken from the shadowy figure, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns etched into its surface. Mom, he said, his voice small. What do we do now? Valia glanced at Marcus, her expression unreadable. We keep moving, she said after a pause. We don't have a choice. Marcus chuckled, though it turned into a grimace of pain. Glad to see you're finally thinking like a survivor. Valia shot him a look. Surviving isn't enough. We need a plan. By the time the stars emerged, the trio had set up a small camp a few miles from the battlefield. The air was cool, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire Marcus had insisted on building. Valia sat across from him, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. She watched as Marcus sharpened his knife, his movements methodical despite his injury. You don't rest, do you? She asked, breaking the silence. Resting gets you killed, Marcus replied without looking up. You're not fighting anyone right now. He paused, the blade of his knife catching the firelight. Not yet, he said quietly. Valia leaned back, her arms crossed. You can't keep carrying this alone. You act like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. Marcus met her gaze, his eyes hard but not unkind. You think I chose this? No, Valia said, her voice softening. But you've made it your purpose. Marcus didn't respond. He set the knife aside and stared into the fire, its glow reflected in his weary eyes. As the night deepened, Solon approached Marcus, clutching the glowing device. I think it's trying to tell us something, the boy said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. It's a rock, kid. Rocks don't talk. It's not just a rock, Solon insisted, holding it out. The etched pattern shifted as he moved it, the glow pulsating faintly. Valia frowned, leaning closer. He's right. It's reacting to him. Marcus took the device, careful not to touch the glowing surface directly. The hum it emitted grew louder, vibrating faintly in his hand. What is this thing? Marcus muttered. It's a locator, Valia said, her voice laced with unease. I've seen similar devices before. They're used to track movement, relay data. Marcus's grip tightened. So they can find us. Maybe, Valia said. But it could also be a beacon. Something to guide us. To what? Marcus asked, his tone sharp. Valia hesitated. A safe haven. Or a trap. Solon tugged at Marcus's sleeve. We should follow it, he said earnestly. If it's a trap, you can stop it. If it's safe, we'll be okay. Marcus stared at the boy, surprised by his conviction. You put a lot of faith in me, kid. Solon nodded. Because you're the strongest. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're going to get me killed, you know that? Valia stood, her expression firm. If this is our best chance, we have to take it. We can't keep running blind. Marcus looked between them, his face a mask of reluctant determination. Fine, but we do it my way. No surprises. The device led them east, its glow growing stronger with every step. The plains gave way to rolling hills, their slopes dotted with strange, luminescent plants that pulsed in the darkness. The terrain felt otherworldly, the air thick with a faint hum that seemed to emanate from the land itself. This place feels alive, Valia said, her voice hushed. Marcus grunted, scanning the area. Feels like a setup. Solon walked ahead, the device lighting his path like a lantern. Despite Marcus's protests, the boy refused to hang back, his excitement outweighing his fear. They crested a hill, and what lay beyond made them stop in their tracks. A massive structure rose from the earth, its surface smooth and black, reflecting the stars above. It looked ancient, yet untouched by time, its edges sharp and precise. Glowing lines ran along its surface, forming patterns that mirrored those on the device. What is that? Valia breathed. Trouble, Marcus muttered. Solon stepped forward, the device in his hands glowing brighter. Before Marcus could stop him, the boy placed it into a recessed slot in the structure's base. The lines on the structure flared to life, illuminating the area in a brilliant blue light. Solon, Valia shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. The ground rumbled, and a section of the structure slid open, revealing a passageway bathed in soft light. Marcus drew his knife, his body tense. Stay behind me. Valia nodded, her grip on Solon tightening. Together, they stepped into the passageway, the air inside warm and strangely comforting. The passage led to a vast chamber, its walls covered in glowing symbols that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it, a holographic display flickered to life. An image appeared, a figure clad in armor, similar to the soldiers they had fought, but different. Its face was uncovered, its features sharp and regal. I am Vikar, the figure said, its voice resonating through the chamber. If you have found this place, you are either desperate or foolish. Great, Marcus muttered. A motivational speech. Valia shot him a look but stayed silent. This sanctuary was created for those who seek refuge from the chaos beyond, Vikar continued. But sanctuary comes at a price. What price? Valia asked, her voice steady despite her unease. Vikar's image turned toward her, as though it could see her. Allegiance. The chamber grew silent, the weight of the word hanging heavy in the air. Marcus's jaw tightened. Allegiance to what? To the resistance, Vikar said. The war that destroyed your worlds is not over. It rages on, and it will find you no matter where you hide. But here, you can fight back. Valia looked at Marcus, her expression torn. We can't keep running, she said softly. Marcus stared at the hologram, his face unreadable. And if we say no? Then you leave, Vikar replied, and take your chances. Marcus closed his eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of Solon, of Valia, of the lives they had already risked so much to protect. When he opened his eyes, his grip on the knife relaxed. We'll stay, he said. For now. Valia reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. Solon looked up at him, his eyes wide with trust. For the first time in years, Marcus felt something new, a sense of belonging. He wasn't just a lone survivor anymore. He was part of something bigger. The chamber's soft glow bathed Marcus, Valia, and Solon in a soothing light as they stood before the hologram of Vikar. The weight of the Resistance's offer hung heavy in the air, but Marcus's decision was made. We'll stay, he had said. Now, as the light dimmed and the hologram flickered away, silence filled the chamber. Marcus glanced at Valia, who held Solon close. She looked calm, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed the weight of her own thoughts. What now? Valia asked, her voice steady. Marcus tightened his grip on his knife, the blade still faintly stained from the earlier battle. Now we figure out what we've signed up for. As if in answer, the chamber rumbled softly. The walls shifted, revealing a corridor that led deeper into the structure. The blue lines that had guided them here pulsed in a rhythm that seemed almost alive, drawing them forward. They followed the glowing path into a larger room, its high ceiling etched with constellations that shimmered faintly. At its center was a table-like structure surrounded by an array of devices that hummed softly, their purpose unclear. Valia stepped forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the strange equipment. "This place was built for more than hiding," she said. "It's a command center. Looks like it hasn't been used in a while," Marcus replied, his tone skeptical. Before Valia could respond, the devices activated. A series of symbols flashed across a central screen, and Vikar's image reappeared, smaller this time. "The resistance requires unity," Vikar said. "You are not alone." Marcus frowned. "What does that mean?" As if to answer, the screen displayed a map of the surrounding region. Dots of light appeared, each one accompanied by faint pulses. Marcus realized they represented other locations, each one similar to the sanctuary they stood in. Valia stepped closer, her hand hovering over the screen. "These are other sanctuaries," she said, her voice filled with awe. "Other survivors." Marcus leaned against the table, his gaze fixed on the glowing map. "So we're not fighting this war alone, after all." The hours that followed were filled with planning and discovery. The sanctuary contained supplies, food, weapons, and medical equipment, all stored in pristine condition. Valia explored with Solon, her initial fear replaced by a cautious optimism. Marcus, however, remained on edge. He paced the room, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. "You can breathe, you know," Valia said, approaching him with a faint smile. "Habit," Marcus replied, though his posture didn't relax. Valia touched his arm, grounding him. "We're safe here. For now." "For now," Marcus repeated. "But it won't last. It never does." "You're right," Valia admitted. "But we have something we didn't have before, a chance to fight back. To make a difference." Marcus studied her, his expression softening. "You really believe that?" "I do," she said, her voice steady. "And I think you do too, even if you won't say it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Guess we'll see." Later that night, as Solon slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, Marcus and Valia sat by a small fire they had built in the sanctuary's central chamber. The soft crackle of the flames filled the silence between them. "I didn't think we'd make it this far," Valia admitted, her gaze distant. "Me neither," Marcus said. "But here we are." She turned to him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Why did you stay with us?" "Back in the cave, you could have left. It would have been easier." Marcus hesitated, his gaze dropping to the flames. "At first, I told myself it was because I felt sorry for you. You and the kid looked half dead, and I've seen enough of that for one lifetime." "But that's not the whole truth," Valia pressed gently. "No," Marcus admitted. He looked at her, his expression unguarded for once. "Somewhere along the way, you stopped being just people I was helping. You became my family." Valia's breath caught, her throat tightening with emotion. "I've done things I'm not proud of," Marcus continued, his voice low. "Things I can't take back. But being with you and Solon, it's like I have a chance to do something right, to be something better." Valia placed her hand over his, her touch warm and steady. "You already are." For a moment, the fire was the only sound. The next morning, they stood at the sanctuary's entrance, the rising sun bathing the plains in golden light. Marcus adjusted the strap of his pack, his knife secured at his side. Valia stood beside him, her resolve clear. Solon, clutching the glowing device, looked up at Marcus with a wide smile. "What now?" the boy asked. Marcus knelt, ruffling Solon's hair. "Now we get to work, kid. Are we going to win?" Solon asked, his eyes full of hope. Marcus glanced at Valia, then back at the boy. "I don't know, but we're going to give it everything we've got." As they stepped into the sunlight, the sanctuary's doors closed behind them with a soft hum. The map they had seen inside remained etched in Marcus's mind, a reminder of the larger fight ahead. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt something he hadn't dared to hope for: purpose. He looked at Valia and Solon, his makeshift family, and a rare smile crossed his face. Together, they would face whatever came next, and no matter the outcome, they would fight for each other. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows that stretched across the plains. In its light, the three figures walked forward, ready to face a new dawn.